may seem that the Book of Esther made uncomfortable reading for the Catholic Church and for Luther. This morbid fascination with Purim was matched by the Nazis. They too saw Purim as part of a pattern of Jewish responsibility for tragic events in human history. And as early as May 1924, Streicher wrote an article called Das Purimfest, the Festival of Purim. April 1935, another Nazi paper called Judenkenner wrote, "Both Hitler and Haman are leaders with a profound knowledge of the Jews." Streicher returned to the Purim theme in August 1935 when the Stürmer linked a story about a Jewish chemist who had tortured a cat to death to, and I quote, the slaughter of 75,000 Persians in the Book of Esther. An obvious analogy. In 1936, the Lutheran professor Johannes Hempel, not the Irish Hempel, may have been a cousin, of the University of Berlin, described the Book of Esther as showing, through its hate-inspired wish fulfillment, his words, how far the fantasy of pursuing vengeance could go among the Jews. We earlier saw how Lutheran Bishop Martin Sasser rejoiced on Kristallnacht. Streicher's rejoicing on Kristallnacht focused on Purim. I quote, "Just as the Jews butchered 75,000 Persians in one night, the same fate would have befallen the German people had the Jews succeeded in inciting a war against Germany. The Jews would have instituted a new Purim festival in Germany." During the Holocaust years, the Nazis cynically and deliberately orchestrated special killings on Purim. Purim, 1942. 10 Jews in Jumkavola were hanged. Why? To avenge the hanging of Haman's 10 sons. Similar incidents occurred in the Piotrków ghetto and in Czestochowa and Radow. Hitler ordered that all synagogues still functioning after Kristallnacht be closed for the day of Purim. Purim also featured prominently in The Eternal Jew, a viciously anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda movie that decivilized and dehumanized the Jewish people in the minds of its audiences. And when the film turns to Purim, the narrator states, "This harmless-looking family celebration commemorates the slaughter of 75,000 anti-Semitic Persians by biblical ancestors of our Jews of today." The film thus changes the feasting and drinking narrative of the Purim story from a story of preservation to a celebration of murder. To mark the 11th anniversary of the Nazi regime coming to power, this is now January the 30th, 1944, exactly 11 years since they came to power, Hitler addressed the German people. Placing the blame on international Jewry for all the ills of Germany and Europe, Hitler warned, and I quote, "If Russia defeats Germany, Jewry would celebrate the destruction of Europe by a second triumphant Purim festival." Quite astonishing. This is what he said to the German people. Lutheran Nazis were not alone in perverting the Purim story. The 19th century theologian W.M.L. de Vetter of the University of Berlin wrote that the Book of Esther displayed a, and I quote, "bloodthirsty spirit of revenge and persecution." I find it difficult to keep a straight face when I quote Friedrich Bleek. No other book of the Old Testament was so far removed from the spirit of the gospel. You don't say, Mr. Bleek. Even the 19th century theologian, professor of ecclesiastical history at Oxford and dean of Westminster Abbey, Arthur Pennyth Stanley, got in on the act. He stated that the continuance of that bitter animosity in the Jewish nation renders the feast of Purim the least pleasing of their festivals. And if anyone imagined that the Holocaust would put an end to clerical Purim bashing, here is Kurt Kuhl in 1953. The Book of Esther's enthusiastic embrace by the Jews among whom it became a great favorite testified to their narrow-minded and fanatical nationalism. Modern anti-Zionist theologian Ted Pike adds his tuppence worth. I quote, "Every book in the Bible condemns the violent racism of modern Zionism except one, the Book of Esther. The source of the annual Feast of Purim, Esther celebrates the Jews' slaughter of more than 75,000 Gentiles, which included women and children. No biblical book has so influenced Israel's brutality against Arabs. Esther thus plays a pivotal role for both Jews and Christians in their unconditional defense of the state of Israel." Thus far this afternoon, we have noted how the Church, Luther, and the Nazis all shared a morbid fascination with Purim. Adopting the Purim custom of turning everything on its head, let's see what Purim has to say about the fate of the Nazis. Chapter 9 of the book of Esther, Queen Esther says to the king, "Let Haman's 10 sons be hanged." Some 2,500 years after this band of 10 brothers met their end on the gallows, another band of 10 brothers met their end on the gallows. I refer, of course, to the Nazi war criminals sentenced to death on the 1st of October 1946 by the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. That year, October the 1st, fell midway between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, a period when traditionally it is decided in heaven who will live and who will die, who by fire and who by hanging. Now, by rights as a military tribunal, the Nuremberg court should have handed down death sentences by firing squad. That is what military tribunals do. And the French judges recommended that the guilty men be shot. The Russian judges were adamant that given how the German army had hanged so many Russians, the Nazi leaders should not be given an honorable death. And in the end, by a majority vote, the Allied judges decided that each of the Nazi war criminals deserved the undignified execution method of hanging. Biblical scholars have long been puzzled by the way the names of Haman's 10 sons are written in the scroll of Esther. Look at the top line, right hand. Those of you who know Hebrew will see circled the letter Taf is small, the letter Shin is small, the letter Zayin is small, and the first letter on the last line is bigger. It's a Vav. The numerical value of the 3 small letters is Tav 400, Shin 300, Zayin 7, total 707. The numerical value of the large Vav is 6, corresponding to the 6th millennium. Put them together in Gematria and you get 5707, the Hebrew equivalent of 1946. Wow. 10 Jew haters hanged 2,500 years ago. 10 Jew haters hanged in 1946.
Amen.
The death sentence was carried out on the 16th of October, which fell that year on the Jewish holiday of Hoshana Rabbah, when traditionally the verdicts of who will live and who will die are finally sealed. There's like a period of grace even after Yom Kippur, and Hoshana Rabbah is the day that the verdicts are sealed, and that was the day they were hanged. Among the 10 Nazi war criminals hanged that day was a gentleman we referred to earlier, Julius Streicher. During his cross-examination in Nuremberg, an unrepentant Streicher argued, and I quote, "Dr. Martin Luther should very probably sit in my place in the defendant's dock today." In the book, The Jews and Their Lies, this is still Streicher, Dr. Martin Luther writes that the Jews are a serpent's brood and one should burn down their synagogues and destroy them. Let's just repeat. Streicher argued that Luther should be there in the dock at the Nazi War Crimes Tribunal. The hangings took place on the 16th of October 1946, Hoshana Rabbah, and they were witnessed by a gentleman called Kingsbury Smith on behalf of the International News Service. He was the only media person allowed to be there on behalf of the world media. And Smith records that when it was Streicher's turn to be led to the gallows, he made 4 utterances. Predictably, the first one was a piercing scream, "Heil Hitler!" The second was confirmation of his name, Julius Streicher. As he reached the hanging platform, Streicher cried out, "Now it goes to God." And as Streicher faced the witnesses to his execution, he suddenly and inexplicably screamed out for posterity, "Purim Fest 1946. The Feast of Purim, 1946. What poetic justice. Moments before he was to be hanged, Streicher had the clarity to spot the link between the Nazi genocide and Haman's attempted genocide. Moments before he was to be hanged, Streicher saw that once again the Jews would rejoice over the downfall of their oppressors. Quite astonishing. And here's another strange link between Purim and the Nazis. Can you guess the name of the Nazi sympathizer who published Hitler's Mein Kampf? It's too bad to be true. Max Haman, which is the way Haman is pronounced in French. And here's another one. We already said earlier that the Hebrew word etz means a tree, gallows, and wood. Same word for all three. And the name of the hangman at Nuremberg was an American army officer by the name of, you couldn't make it up, John C. Woods, Mr. Etz. And after he hanged the 10 Nazi war criminals, Mr. Etz burnt the hoods and the ropes and refused to accept $2,500 that he had been offered for them. And Mr. Etz was thus directly mirroring a verse in the book of Esther, which says, "The Jews of Shushan mustered again on the 14th day of Adar and slew 300 men in Shushan, but they did not lay hands on the spoil." In conclusion, the Persian leader Haman in the book of Esther provides us with the first recorded example of Jew hatred. The early church fathers echoed this Jew hatred. The 4th century John Chrysostom, called the Golden Mouthed, held that because Jews rejected the Christian God in human flesh, Christ, they deserved to be killed. In his words, grew fit for slaughter. Chrysostom quoted Luke 19:27 to claim that Jesus was speaking about Jews when he said, "As for these enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slay them before me." 1,000 years later, Martin Luther vied with the early church fathers in his Jew hatred. Luther may have sought to change the face of the established church, but he promoted Jew hatred to a level matched only by the Crusades and the Inquisition. And in the 20th century, Luther's heirs, Hitler and the Nazis, took Jew hatred to a new level as they tried to implement Luther's eliminationist rhetoric. The philosopher Karl Jaspers got it right when he said succinctly about Luther's On the Jews and Their Lies, there you already have the whole Nazi program. Ladies and gentlemen, I do not need to remind you that the phenomenon of Jew hatred is still with us. Last Sunday I was in Belfast attending the rededication ceremony for the vandalized graves in Belfast's Jewish cemetery, a hate crime for which no one has yet been arrested in the 7 months since 8 thugs attacked the gravestones with hammers. Every day we hear of new threats to Jewish institutions in the USA and elsewhere. And here in Ireland, we have not been without daubings and online threats. But the good news, my friends, is that the Jewish people survived Haman's genocidal plans. The Jewish people survived Luther's genocidal plans. The Jewish people survived Hitler's genocidal plans. And the Jewish people will survive the genocidal plans of a new generation of Persian Jew haters. Happy Purim.